Hey everybody, Jake here with TrendSpider to go over the weekend video update into the second half of September, starting with the broad markets, touching on Bitcoin, and then going into some individual names. Starting with the SPY, the S&P 500 ETF. Definitely not the strongest week for SPY looking at the weekly candle here on the right-hand side of the chart. Huge, not only bearish engulfing candle, but also an outside bar. So pretty much taking out the entire range of the previous week to the downside and breaking through the symmetrical triangle here through that previous support zone. So all in all, a pretty rough week here overall. And then on the daily chart, you can see here on the left-hand side that we are, gaining a little bit of traction towards the end of the day on Friday. Remember, I always do these videos on Friday, but still a gap below that fills right around 379 or so. So on the daily and the weekly chart, definitely some downside potentially here. But as always, follow price action. That's really the only thing that's going to keep you honest in the markets. But I mean, for the daily candle, you do have that gap below, and on the weekly candle, you do have that breakdown. So all in all, the trend is definitely pointing to potentially a little more downside before we potentially test what we saw back in June. And from there, if we break down further, we'll go from there. But SPY definitely not looking great. But throughout this entire video, you're going to see a lot of charts looking very similar, most of them breaking down. So Qs, the same thing. We pretty much filled that gap from mid-July. Decent candle here. You've got, I guess you can call that a hammer off that gap area, but still just, not incredibly bullish with this symmetrical triangle breaking down, not only on the daily chart, but also on the weekly chart. So once again, pretty much the same exact setup here that we saw on SPY, breaking down through the symmetrical triangle, which could potentially be, your direction in the medium term moving forward. So, weeks to months, potentially to the downside here. Now going into IWM is an interesting one because technically we are kind of at a crossroads here. So if we look at the daily, you can see here from the all-time high VWAP zone, we rejected this many weeks ago and have not looked back. You actually do not have any gaps below here on IWM to fill, but still, just not incredibly great looking price action here. I usually don't do this type of kind of like X marks the spot view here on the weekly that I'm showing, but you can see here that we're at a pretty crucial area where you have this previous resistance area acting as potential support. That's your SR flip. But then you also have this other support zone here, pretty much starting back from June, that kind of creates this like literally X marks the spot on the chart. So this is a huge area to hold simply because you've got a lot of market participants looking at this area. You've got participants that are looking at this previous resistance zone, potentially acting as support, but you also have this previous area of support potentially acting as another area of support. But if we don't hold, both of these areas are going to break, and that's essentially going to create a potential bigger move down simply because this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You've got multiple people, multiple market participants, groups of market participants seeing the same area. So if this area breaks, you're going to have multiple sell signals here from multiple people in the multiple participants in the market seeing the same thing. So all in all, IWM definitely at a make or break point here. Going into Bitcoin, just simply kind of our risk proxy, if you want to call it that, gauge of the markets. You can see here on the daily chart, we have this descending triangle. Descending triangles are typically bearish, but they're only bearish if they break down. So we need to see where this goes from here. But all in all, we're getting close to the apex of the setup, and that's where we're going to likely get some type of move. As we get closer and closer to the essentially end of this setup, that's where you're going to see either a break to the upside or the downside. But then if you look at the weekly candle, you'll see here that we've already broken down here on the weekly chart. You essentially have a retest of this previous support zone. So if you go and kind of dive a little deeper into this, you can see that you had support, you broke down, you retested that the previous week, and then this week we pretty much rejected right at this area. So all in all, the week is not over for crypto, so just keep that in mind because I do these videos on Friday. But all in all, not an incredibly strong candle as of now for Bitcoin. Now, diving into some individual names, we'll start with Apple. And a lot of these names are going to look very similar, right? We're breaking down. The main thing here on Apple was looking at the volume weighted average price from the June low. It created a little bit of a zone here that broke down on Friday or on Thursday, continued down today on Friday. Have a little bit of a hammer here on the daily candle for Friday, but all in all, still not an incredibly great looking setup with all of this supply above. Remember, anytime price is above this volume shelf, that is going to act as an area of support. As soon as price breaks below that area, that's going to act as an area of a supply, so aka resistance. So if we do continue up next week, 154 all the way up to around 156 is going to be an area of resistance above. Now, on the weekly chart, you can see here if I pull up the COVID low VWAP, we tested that within about 5% of that COVID low VWAP. That's what this zone is back in June. So if we do have more downside, look at this candle on the weekly chart. It's not only a bearish engulfing candle, literally engulfing the entire previous week, but also an outside bar. Also the range of this week's candle, essentially engulfing this entire move. Actually, the last 2 weeks, it's engulfing that entire move. So all in all, not an incredibly good looking candle, but with these types of candles, you can always get an inside bar and then we go from there. So as always, we will look at price action evolving from Friday as I do this video until next week, and then we'll kind of see how things look. But all in all, we did break down through some pretty crucial levels. Going into Microsoft, we surprisingly are right back to where we started from June. So this is something that you're not seeing across the board. Microsoft is definitely one of those names that is retesting the June lows, which isn't an incredibly great sign, but all in all, we did actually hold this area. You got a decent, if you want to call that a hammer on the daily chart, I'd call it more of like a hammer doji type setup here. But all in all, you're testing the June lows, potential double bottom, but that's a potential double bottom. If we break below this area, definitely not looking great for Microsoft. And another thing that's not looking great for Microsoft is the fact that we did break down through this trend zone here starting from late 2018. You can see here that we finally broke through this area. All in all, not a great look here. A lot of the time, depending on if you're looking at a break of support or resistance, you're a lot of the time going to get a retest of that area. So who knows? Maybe we move back up to the 260s to low 270s before continuing down. But all in all, that 3-year trend has started to break down here on Microsoft. Going into Snow, not Snow ETH, actual Snowflake. Snowflake has been one of those names that has held very well, and it's kind of reminds me a little bit of Solar here. Solar is definitely, almost a hedge for the markets. Anytime the market's up, Solar's down. Anytime the markets are down big, Solar somehow seems to be up. Same thing with Snow here. Snow did actually follow the broad markets here on Friday. You can see a pretty big move to the downside, over 5% to the downside. You have a gap below that is pretty much in line with this previous support zone here, this diagonal support zone, right around 163 to 165. And remember, this is a function of time. So let's say that price takes 2 weeks to get to this area below, then all of a sudden this area becomes potential support in the upper 170s. So just remember, anytime you're looking at a diagonal support zone, you essentially are following this as a function of time. So just because today downside potential support was in the 160s, if that takes 2 to 3 weeks, this support zone moves up all the way to the 170s. So just keep that in mind. But the main thing I think would be to mainly focus on this gap below in the lower 160s. You can see here on the daily chart that we did reject right at this symmetrical triangle resistance zone. So not a great looking candle going into the week ahead. Maybe some downside, but as always, just let price action kind of figure things out from here. Next thing we will look at is NEO. And NEO is one of those names that just has not done incredibly well around this November high VWAP zone. So you can see here that we have the VWAP. This is just your blue line here. We actually broke above it back in June. And so this is when I would add what's called just a percentage band offset. So I'm going to add a 5% offset here. And that's going to actually take into account this false breakout above this zone. So that's why I have the 5% offset. And you'll see here that we got rejected literally right at the actual VWAP. So if I take this percentage VWAP off and just go to the no bands, you'll see here that we rejected almost exactly at this line. That doesn't happen incredibly often. But in this case, it did. It rejected right off that area. We had a big move to the downside after that. And, from here, we have gaps below. So if you turn on the gap detector here, you'll see here that we do have 2 gaps below. So we have a gap that fills right around 19, let's call it 50, and then another gap that fills below right around 17.75, give or take a few cents. So we do have gaps below that we could fill if we do continue down, and those would be the main areas to watch on NEO as far as the daily chart. And I'll throw this VWAP zone on, or this VWAP on again. But all in all, a perfect rejection of where you'd expect on NEO. And then on the daily or on the weekly chart, you will see here that we did break out of this, 9 to 10 month trend zone here, this red zone here, and we technically broke above it. We retested this area, so could this potentially be an SR flip, meaning a support resistance flip? In this case, resistance became potential support if we do catch a bid going into next week here, but we will just have to see kind of what's going on. And really, that's kind of all I have. As far as Tesla goes, one thing I'll point out here on Tesla is the fact that we do have an SR flip. So we just talked about that on NEO, and you actually do have a decent candle here on the daily chart. So you've got this April high is when you start this trend zone, resistance zone to the downside. We broke out, retested it twice. So, is this just simply an SR flip? We'll have to see, but this area right here is definitely a crucial area to hold. If we do break to the upside, I would definitely keep in mind this just 314 to 318 area, essentially just this area that I highlighted in yellow as a potential resistance area, simply because it's been resistance pretty much since May. We retested it back in August. We retested again in mid-August, and then that would be your potential area to retest once again if we do bounce off this previous resistance zone that we so far are bouncing off on Friday. Now, on the weekly chart, you'll see here that we are going to measure the volume by price from the all-time highs. So pretty much where has volume aggregated since we hit these all-time highs? And you'll see here, we actually had a green week for Tesla, and Tesla is a lot of the time kind of a high beta proxy for the market. So if the market's going down a lot, Tesla's going to get rocked. If the market's going, up a lot, Tesla is generally leading the market. In this case, really rough week in the markets, but we actually had a green close here on Tesla, which is very interesting to see. And you'll see here, if we anchor the volume by price from the all-time highs, we are above this point of control and the volume shelf. The point of control is simply just this volume node that is essentially the biggest volume bar that's sticking out to the left. So the fact that we're above that area means that we're holding above where a lot of people are essentially at break even. So a lot of the time, this area can act as almost kind of like a launch pad for price. And we'll see if that's the case going into next week. But all in all, I'd say this is one of my favorite setups going into the week ahead for more upside, simply because we do have the weekly candle looking decent over that volume by price, not only point of control, but volume shelf, which the volume shelf is really just the aggregation of volume nodes here that creates almost a shelf for price. And we'll see where we go from here. But all in all, the fact that we did hold this previous resistance zone on the daily chart and hold above the weekly point of control here on the weekly chart is definitely more optimistic than pessimistic going into the week ahead. Hopefully this video is helpful for everybody. Everybody have a great weekend. We'll see you. I'm not sure if I'm doing a video next week, but the week after that, I'll definitely be doing a video. And everybody have a great weekend. If you like these videos, please like and subscribe. And remember, if you do want to try out TrendSpider, we do have a 7-day free trial. They can try it out, see if it's for you. If not, no worries, cancel. If it is, we really appreciate your business. And everybody, as I mentioned before, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.